So Elena is a senior data scientist at Airbnb, and she leads a team of data scientists responsible for the user online experience and offline experience as well. The team partners with the product team to understand and optimize all parts of the product, using experimentation in a wide variety of contexts. Elena completed a doctorate in education at Stanford, where she built predictive models of friendship in schools and modeled the impact of peers on educational outcomes. I'd also like to introduce Kevin Novak from Uber. Kevin is Uber's head of data science platform. Since joining in July 2011, Kevin's contributed to a significant part of Uber's engineering and scientific work as an engineer, scientist, and leader. Before Uber, Kevin earned his graduate degree in physics, there's another one, from Michigan State, where his academic work involved nuclear physics theory and the statistical verification of heavy ion collision models. And your host and moderator for this panel will be Uri, a senior data scientist at our Cloudera data science team. Take it away.
Thanks. So I think we're supposed to be talking about today, in particular, we want to talk about hypergrowth startups and how to do data science there. Maybe first off, you can tell us what your companies do in case no one's heard of them yet.
We do cars. No, it's actually funny. I was thinking about, you were talking about, one of the things we were talking about is, what defines a hypergrowth startup. And I actually remember, for me, the fact that, as soon as I felt like I had to stop explaining what Uber was in all of my talks and decks, that was when I felt like we hit the hypergrowth phase. So it's that was a joke intended for us, but it's actually totally relevant. As soon as you're through the conceptual phase, I felt like we hit growth at Uber.
Okay, so Elena, what kind of defines hypergrowth from your perspective? Are your companies still in hypergrowth, would you say?
Yeah, sure. So for those of you who don't know, Airbnb is an online marketplace for accommodations. So if you have an extra space in your home or an extra home or even a treehouse in your backyard, you can list it on Airbnb, and then people who are coming to your area, our guests, can book your place and pay you money to stay in that home. So I started at Airbnb about 3.5 years ago, and when I started, I was one of 5 data scientists, and our team is now 50 data scientists. And so we've more than doubled every single year, and that's still happening. So for me, that feels really fast, and so it feels like we're still in a hypergrowth stage.
Okay, so then how would you say that your job has changed, in a day-to-day way, over the time that you've been at the company?
Sure. So again, as I said, I started about 3.5 years ago. We had a team of 5, which is actually kind of big, I think, for the size of our company. But we were really fulfilling all analytical functions at the company at that time. So I think when you're at an early stage company, the data science role is totally varied. You can be doing everything from helping with the search ranking algorithm to designing a report to give the CEO some basic metrics on a weekly basis. And so it's really just whatever the company needs, you kind of figure out how to do it, and do it in maybe a slightly hacky way too, because you need to move really quickly. And so I think one of the cool things for me has been seeing how, as we've grown, our tooling has developed a ton. We don't necessarily need to spend as much time on a simple task like how many homes do we have in Vancouver, which used to actually be somewhat complicated, and now it's much, much easier, and a data scientist doesn't even need to do that. And so that's been a really big change over the past few years as we've grown and scaled.
Well, so I think that this morning in the panel, I think DeYoung was talking about how, someone asked a question about what does your infrastructure look like? And that was a panel on early stage startups. And I guess that question was a joke because the answer was basically just a bunch of Python scripts that are kind of hacked together.
Yeah.
And now you're talking about how you have a lot of tooling at the company. At what point do you start to put in place? And I'll say I work at Cloudera, and so we develop Hadoop, and so I know as well as anyone how horrible an experience it is to use Hadoop. And so,
wow.
At what point do you say to yourself, it's time to start moving away from these Python, one-off Python scripts and actually start putting in place this kind of gargantuan, or potentially more gargantuan infrastructure? And same thing for you.
When you just can't take it anymore, I guess is part of the answer. So I think a great example for us is, when I first started, we were running nightly cron jobs for all of our data pipelines, and I think that's a pretty classic thing for people to be doing at their startups. And we started to realize that we didn't have enough hours in the day for all the dependencies to run. Like we were like, this one's going to start an hour after the last one, and then we're like, wait, this like can't work anymore, and we like really need a more sophisticated system. And so for us, that was when we were like, okay, like now we need to really look into this. We started off with building a tool called Kronos, and now we've actually open sourced an even better tool called AirPal, which is used for all of our data pipelining. But for us, that was kind of where it happened, was when we were like, we just really can't use this anymore for our tooling.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, pain is an incredibly powerful motivating factor. No, I think for us it was stemming from this realization, both from on an individual level. Like a great example for this was when we rolled out like estimated time of arrival. You know, a car will be here in 5 minutes, 4 minutes. Early on, we used Google, like straight up. Like 2011, we were just passing through from their APIs, and then we realized like we could do some pretty simple additions on top of Google to get a slightly better rollout, right? And it usually had to do with like, as you get more Uber trips, you figure out, you know, how Suburbans operate relative to Priuses, how Kevin the driver operates relative to different drivers. And so we have all these models that we're rolling out, and like me and Henry would like manually hand deploy these models and make all these judgment calls. And it was terrible. Like it was just like literally weeks just doing the same repetitive task for every Uber market, for every product line. So like just simple investment in removing my own frustration became one of these like mechanisms by which we scale. The other big thing, like this also happens organizationally. Like we had a team that was super hybrid. Like we would do everything from analysis and research through implementation and prototyping and support rotations and feature maintenance, et cetera. And eventually you end up in this world where like your economists and statisticians are on PagerDuty alerts and your engineers are trying to like attend KDD and are not getting anything out of it. And like that's when we split the team up into more specialized groups. So I think it's not just in the tech space, but also in sort of the organizational space.
So just bring it back to something that you just said about how you recently open sourced some tools that you've developed. It sounds like, you know, a lot of small companies have an easier time than ever nowadays building out all the tools that they need because of such a great open source ecosystem. But I feel like I've heard some anecdotal evidence that basically at every one of these companies that ends up growing, at some point people throw away some of the open source tools and decide that they need to build their own tools. They need to re-implement some machine learning model. They need to implement their own query system or something like that. Has that happened at both of your organizations? And is that kind of a necessary part of the trajectory when you're going through hypergrowth? Does that always happen?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's certainly the case. I mean, with many vendors at Uber, there's always been this sort of like hero's arc of like, oh my God, this is the best thing ever. Like we've solved all of our problems. Okay, take it or leave it. I'll add some features. Why did I ever implement this thing? Dear Lord, let's cut this whole thing out and move on to the next thing. And that happens like, I think that's just part of the process of scaling beyond different regimes. That said, like I don't ever think, even now, Uber 5,000, 6,000 people is continuing to embrace new open source technologies. So I don't ever think, or if we have at this point, or if it exists, Uber hasn't hit this point of us moving fully beyond, leveraging the open source community and contributing to it.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely echo the same sentiments. I think, for us, it's really like we just need to get the best result in the fastest way possible. And so we will definitely utilize whatever is open source as much as we can. And where we found the need to build our own tooling is in cases where the open source software just doesn't meet the particularities of our context, right? So, we have some pretty interesting problems when it comes to experimentation, for example, where we have a lot of non-logged in users who are accessing from many different devices. And we were able to greatly improve our experimentation results if we were able to kind of map the cookie to the user ID and do some back-end work to get our more rigorous experimentation results. And that's something where it's a little particular to our context, and so we had to build that out because of the nature of the problem that we were trying to solve. And so it's not to say that open source is not useful, but I think you just have to know when it will work and when, for your context, you have to make some modifications.
Okay, do you have, so would you say that Uber and Airbnb are both pretty data-driven companies in the spectrum of data to vision-driven, or Google to Apple?
Yeah, we can both answer that one. I think for Airbnb, I actually never use the term data-driven. I usually talk about it as data-informed. I think Airbnb is for sure a mission-driven company in the sense that, we want hosts and guests around the world to feel like they belong anywhere, and that is our vision. And so we see data as a really important way to reach our vision. And so, all of our teams will have objective key results, and our data team is tasked with helping us to get there using data in the best way possible. And so, I think that's a really nice mix where it is vision driven, but you see data as a way to get to that vision. And that's not to say that data doesn't inform what we set as our key results. For sure it does. But it's not the case that it's this is the only thing that decides what we do. It's an input. And I think that's actually a really important thing to recognize. So, for all of our data work, there will be biases, right? There will be problems with the way we've done the analysis. The sample might not be exactly right. Maybe the context will change over time. And, we ran this experiment now, but the result might be different later. And a really important realization is to say, hey, there are these limitations to our data and our work, and so we want to make sure that this is a key input to how we're making decisions, but it's not the be-all, end-all, and so we do need to keep our vision in mind and take into account many different inputs into how we make decisions. So although I think we have a really strong culture of using data at the company, and this is the case across the company, I would never call us data-driven for that reason.
Yeah, the notion of what specifically data-driven means is sort of right up there with what is data science, is the 50 different people give you 50 different answers. I think Uber is a culture, and I actually think most startups are this way, whether they admit it or not, where decision-making is much more akin to a school of fish or a flock of birds. Whoever is at the front of the school is really the person who's steering, and everyone sort of follows. And if you want to drive, you have to figure out a way to get to the front of the school of fish, right? So for us, there have been lots of instances where data can definitely drive big decisions at the company, but it's usually a result of us as a team having the infrastructure and technology in place, especially in the workflow regime, to help us have the information we need quick enough, fast enough to make decisions basically faster than Travis can sort of make a sort of vision judgment call. But there are lots of times where data is the last person to sort of get along. I remember early on, actually, this is probably surprising to most people, dynamic pricing was one of these things that Travis early on, literally when I joined, is we're going to do this and it's going to be amazing. And I'm I'm not an economist, but this is going to be a complete disaster. I'm telling you right now, it's never going to work. And this was me, as the statistician, as the economist, is thinking, okay, yeah, in theory it works, but we're never going to implement it as a product. And that was something where vision totally led initially. Now that we're through the proof of concept phase, that's one of the biggest things the data science team leads on. Optimization is entirely data-driven on dynamic pricing now. So I think it's totally situational.
Has the attitude changed over time in terms of how data plays a role in the decisions that are made? And are more people that are data-driven running to the front of the flock?
Sure. I would say the attitude as far as what Travis's expectations has been of me has not changed since day one, but his level of frustration on how well me and the team can execute will definitely wax and wane with how well we're doing at building this technology. I think a lot of companies, everyone should aspire to be data-driven. I think it's a healthy tension. Realities is startups are messy. Startup engineering is even messier. Startup engineering for data at a high growth company is one of the most complex, hard problems we're going to tackle. And it's okay to admit it's a tough problem to wrestle with, but never be complacent about the culture, the expectations you have of your data.
Yeah, I mean, I think one challenge that we've also faced at Airbnb is that 2 of our founders are designers, and they really appreciate data, but we do have many people at the company who don't necessarily have an analytical background. And so, one of the really fun things has been to share with those people how we're using data and to have them be bought into using data. And so that's where, the structure of your team can also make a really big difference. So we work as cross-functional teams. So while we have a centralized data science team, each data scientist is actually embedded with a product development team, working really closely with the designers and the engineers. And so when you have someone who's really analytical as that partner through the entire process of setting the roadmap and the vision to evaluating and even in executing and creating data products, I think that can help to create a culture where data is really respected. I think the other thing that makes a really big difference too is some early wins and hiring people that are actually really easy to get along with and can talk to non-data people. So that's a really tough thing to find, I think, in our industry. Often people who are really statistically minded, great programmers, maybe are not able to explain their machine learning model to someone who has no background in statistics. And so, we found that hiring people who are able to communicate as maybe earlier hires has made a really big difference in terms of building out the culture and developing a kind of continued reliance on data. So one example of this is a project that we worked on pretty early on with our operations team. And so this is a case where we had started to hire hundreds of people around the world to call our hosts and give them suggestions about how to improve their listing. And so, this was a huge operation, and so our team was tasked with, are we getting a return on our investment? Are we doing this the right way? And we were like, well, we really have no idea because, we look at our data and the hosts that you're calling are better than the hosts that you're not calling already. So if we compare the outcomes of the hosts you're calling to the ones you're not calling, we're not going to get the right estimate of the effect, right? And so, then we were like, hey, we need to run an experiment. And this, was a message that was going to people who did not know anything about experimentation, right? This is not an engineering team. I think many engineering teams will be very comfortable with talking about experimentation. This was an operations team. And so, a lot of the kind of convincing to get them to do an experiment was about kind of clearly explaining what would be the positive impact of this. And selection bias is super hard for people to understand. So this was a really big challenge, but it made a big difference. So we did convince the team to run an experiment where we had a 10% holdout group. And when we looked at the results were totally different from if you had not run an experiment. So in the past, the conclusion was that calling the host made this really positive impact on future bookings and revenue. When we ran an experiment, the effect was 0. And so, that was a case where we were able to say, hey, we use this much more rigorous data methodology, and we get a really different answer, and this changes the shape of the business. And because we were able to have really good relationships with the people who were making decisions about whether to run an experiment, we were then able to do this. And that has also helped us now in the future with creating a data-driven culture where we actually now run experiments for all of our operations teams as a standard best practice because we set that up early on as something that was going to be key for the decision-making about the effectiveness of the programs.
I mean, it sounds like a big part of your role in some sense is like a data evangelist internally, and that you have to do a lot of work just convincing people that what you're doing is we should take the extra effort to do this more rigorous, more difficult thing that requires more infrastructure.
I think that's the start, but then it gets a lot easier because then that becomes the norm and people are like, wait, you're not running an experiment? How is that possible? And that's great. So it's sort of like I mentioned, kind of the early people I think are really key to this, to having people who are able to communicate because once it happens and that is the norm, it becomes so much easier to perpetuate.
Well, so that brings me to another question, and you also mentioned in terms of hiring people, so you said that, earlier when we were talking, that you yourself have a very interdisciplinary background. And, it sounds like from the panel this morning that, when you're a data scientist at a really small company, you're basically doing everything, and you're in mostly shoveling shit, but a lot of other stuff too. And then you were saying, Signal Kevin, how at this point, now Uber's data team is split up into lots of different groups, and you probably hire PhDs that specialize in lots of different things. How does that happen? And one of the things that we talk about a lot in data science is that when people get hired early on, they really need to be able to not just do the modeling, but also kind of integrate with the production systems at the company. Mike was talking earlier about how difficult it is to have different systems generating models, have to talk to each other. How do you kind of deal with this tension that things can become more and more specialized, and how do you hire for that?
Sure. Yeah, I can definitely. Sorry. Yeah, I can definitely talk about this. I mean, I started Uber Data Science as its own sort of standalone organization on January 1 of 2014, and I had one direct report, and I had to make 35 hires in the first 8 months. So I got very good at recruiting data scientists. I think mostly as the company grows, like recruiting a good team is really an exercise in understanding like what needs to change, but also an exercise in understanding like what absolutely cannot change, right? Like this has to. And so I think that there's definitely, certainly at Uber, there's a good rule of thumb that the younger, more scrappier product lines, the newer ideas tend to attract generalists, or they'd be more successful, and more mature tends to be specialists. Not always true, but that's certainly been the case. A lot of what we tend to go after, though, now is exactly literally identical to when I joined in 2011, and a lot of it has to do with finding people who are sort of viscerally excited about the mission, the problem you're trying to solve, right? And early on, it's like eminently pragmatic. Startups are hard, and they're a lot of hours, and there's lots of ways they can go wrong for reasons which have nothing to do with you personally. And so, like, if you're gonna sign up for this, like, you'd better sign up for something that you think is awesome and amazing, because otherwise you're just like, screw this, I don't want to be here anymore. So, like, it was a very pragmatic situation early on. As you get a little bit bigger, and especially as we've been growing very quick, it's really hard. As a leader, I spend a lot of time thinking about, like, how do we get a group of 100 people to interact with each other really effectively, right? And I can cheat a little bit by like hiring people who have strong personality and vision alignment, right? That like just makes it easier for all of us to connect. So that same passion and reason why you're there, like we look for it in everyone, but for different reasons as we've gotten bigger. I think definitely SF is weird. The tech scene is weird in the sense that like people will take your phone call for different reasons at different phases of your company's growth, right? Like there's sort of this trendiness about like, oh, it's Uber, so like of course they'll take the phone call. But if the people are interested in like early stage, high risk, high reward type scenarios, you've got people who want more stability. So the other thing is just trying to like find the archetype of person, most of which has to do absolutely nothing with the business itself, but all the exogenous sort of factors that go into it. Also plays a big part into recruiting.
I'm happy to answer that too. I think I would say exactly the same thing. You know, we're still hiring for pretty much the same profile, except that I think now we have a couple job recs that are like very specialized for those particular projects where, you know, it is just working on the pricing model, or it's building, you know, some text processing system that like we need that very particular skill set, and it might not be something where the person is moving around to lots of different projects. But you know, we definitely look for people who are excited about the project. I think one thing that's been really cool also for our team is I think we have managed to attract a really diverse team, which has been really fun. And I think having lots of different opinions and backgrounds and people from different fields makes it really exciting and helps you to continue to innovate even as your product is changing and, you know, maybe becoming more specialized in some ways. So that would be the other thing I would add there.
Cool. So my timer says we have 10 more minutes. Do we have time for questions from the audience, or do we need to? Are people too hungry?
I know. I could be.
Yeah. All right. Let's take some audience questions.
So to the earlier point you made about experimentation, I feel like it's a no-brainer to do experiments when they're cheap. It's much more interesting when the experiments are expensive. How do you think about the decision process for an experiment, which will take a lot of work?
Interesting. So I think the other piece here is to think about like how you can make it cheaper, if that makes any sense. So, in a lot of the cases, actually, the programs are already rolled out, and the experiment is making it cheaper by saying don't do this for a certain population. And I think it's also just thinking about like what is the purpose of your experiment, right? Like, if you are trying to understand how your business is operating, you have to have some way to do that. And, any program you're launching, it's going to be pretty hard to continue it if you don't have some justification for the impact of it. And so I think that's something where when you have a culture of people saying like, well, what is the impact of this thing that you're doing? Some form of evaluation becomes a no-brainer, and then it becomes like, maybe that particular experiment is expensive, but in almost all cases, it's really not. Like, I don't think we've had a case where running the experiment would be too expensive, because usually it's the case where they're like, we just want to launch this to everyone, and we're like, no, don't do that. Like, please run it as an experiment. I don't think we've necessarily had that case. I think where it does become expensive is more in the sense of like, worries about not necessarily getting the biggest bang right away, right? Like maybe people are like, well, we think this is going to be really good, and we don't want to lose out on whatever gains we'll get from launching it to everyone, right? And that's maybe more the case than like the setup is expensive, but it's like, what will we miss out if we think ex ante there's going to be a huge gain? And again, it's usually been pretty easy to say, well, you don't know that that's the case. You don't know what the gain is. And a lot of times you actually want to know the exact amount of the gain, because that will determine how much you continue to invest in it and how you spend that money. So.
Sure. Yeah, I sort of thinking about your question and like, the notion of an experiment being expensive, I couldn't quite tell if you were going for risk or for dollars and cents or both. Certainly, like running risky experiments, those of you who know Travis know that I have an executive group that's not afraid to take big risks. So there's certainly like a culture aspect here. But one of the other things that's actually common at Uber, but especially in experimentation, is like this principle that like if you want to build a company that's comfortable taking big risks and like doing these like nonlinear jumps, massive turns, like build technology that takes the downside risk out of doing those moves, right? So like a lot of stuff on the engineering front, that means we do a lot of investment in continuous integration and automated rollback. So the idea of like you can deploy things and feel comfortable that if they don't work for any of the reasons which we've encountered before and the ones we can suppose are highly likely to work, like we'll automatically roll it back for you. In experimentation, it's very common at Uber to have a lot of very passionate, smart, otherwise competent people, like very confidently design bad experiments, right? I think this is very true pretty much anywhere. So like, we spend a lot of time, the data scientists used to work on the experimentation team of like addressing that specific problem. Like, given that I know you're excited about this problem space, how do I help you make the smartest possible decision? Sort of in that same philosophy of like, if we're going to make a risky experiment, we're going to know that it is as statistically rigorous as we can possibly make it before it hits the world.
So Kevin, you talked about spending a lot of your time thinking, sorry, over here.
Perfect, there we are.
Yeah, spending a lot of your time thinking about how to keep the 100 data scientists feel like they're a part of a community.
Sure.
I'm curious, for both of you, what have been some of the real tactical things that you've done as you've scaled that have worked, that the data scientists have really liked and engaged with?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that I did, besides just having like a team identity, is making big organizational moves within data science organization that made sense from the scientific point of view. And what I mean by this is like, for example, I run a team that does anomaly detection, just sort of processes lots of data, pulls out anomalies, and that can be applied to everything from fraud to like DevOps, detecting and predicting service outages, through like logistics problems, traffic mapping, what have you. Like those are all fundamentally the same data problem, and we have data scientists who are working on that, who collaborate with each other, even though those are like 3 totally different business applications and 3 totally different parts of the company. Like having that sort of like organizing in a way which is like the distances are proportional to how a data scientist thinks about the problems can definitely breed that. The other big thing that I tend to do is usually I don't tend to like organize a curriculum. Instead, I try and like give opportunities for the other 99 data scientists to share ideas with everyone. So instead of like, a good example is we do like a session. So there was a product thing called like the drink show and tell. And so we decided to create something in parallel for data that was the drink and think, which is like literally like, everybody has a beer. It usually happens in the evening, and it's just sort of like an open seminar for anybody at the company to present something to a group of people for whom it is totally okay to just go super deep in the weeds on something data science related in a way that maybe you can't in any other forum. And that's worked really well, especially as we've gotten a little bit bigger. Say post 50 people.
I mean, Elena, you actually were telling me earlier that you kind of formalized that in a certain fashion at Airbnb.
Yeah,
how did that happen?
So definitely I think learning from others and knowledge sharing is really important for creating that kind of sense of identity and also helping people to grow and develop and progress in their careers. And one really cool thing that we created at Airbnb, so we noticed that like all of us were doing interesting work. Sometimes it was being sent in an email to a product team and then it would disappear, right? Like that was not something that was easy to search for. If you weren't on the email list, you might never see it. And we also had kind of informally been using Google Sites for blog posts internally, and we realized that like we wanted to come up with something that was like massively better than this. And so we did an offsite over a year ago where we said, we want to learn from each other. We want to push the boundaries. We want the company to use data in a much better way and have access to all of our insights. And what could we design that would meet that need? And we came up with this idea that we called the knowledge repository, which is essentially we're using GitHub. We have a Git repository, and people on the team will check in Markdown files. So easy to generate using IPython Notebook or R Markdown or whatever tool, just make a Markdown file. And then it renders in Git pages, and it's easily searchable. And we had some formality around this where we said, every post needs to have tags. There has to be a TLDR. And we have peer review. So any post that gets published to the knowledge repository needs to have someone peer review it. And that's been extremely powerful for us. And we also added some kind of fun interactive features to make it more user-friendly. So like you can like heart your posts and do searches and follow tags and add comments. And this has actually really transformed the way that our team interacts with each other and how we share knowledge. So you can really easily say, like, I want to know what's happening on trust and safety. And you can go and look in the knowledge repo and see all of the posts that have been made on trust and safety. And you can read all of their code. So that's the beautiful thing about our Markdown and IPython Notebook. It's all integrated. We have internal packages, so you can essentially run an entire analyses just within that Markdown and see the entire history. And so this has been great for the data science team. It's actually also been unbelievable for the whole company. So, we kind of released this, and it was meant to be internal initially, and but anyone at the company could access it. And so what we found was that people from all over the company were reading these posts and getting ideas for what they should do based on the data that they were seeing in the posts. So, one great example of this was, about a year ago, a data scientist was like, I'm going to try out some new forecasting packages in R, and I just want to see what they do, and I'm going to try and predict our bookings for the future. And wrote up this really nice post overview, describing the different methods of forecasting and the benefits of each different tool. And that was then picked up by another team and then used to implement a demand prediction type of model. And it kind of started by someone reading that post, right? So, maybe they would have come up with it otherwise, but it's been really cool to kind of accelerate and share the spread of knowledge. And also for the whole company, so my team works on, right now we're trying to recruit new hosts and help hosts to be successful. And we do have people around the world working on this. And they may not necessarily meet with our data science team, but they read our knowledge posts. And they will send us emails asking us questions and writing comments. And so that's been a really cool way to kind of share knowledge and data. Beyond that, with our team, we definitely, so we have a learning lunch, which is really fun, which is also a seminar series where people can present their work. Onboarding has actually been a really cool tool for us. So we have what's called the Moose Camp. So our spirit animal is the moose. Don't ask why, it's a long story, but we've embraced it, and so our new hires all go through Moose Camp, and this is a series of classes and training, and they create a project, and then they share it with the whole team. And so I think that kind of institution really helps to have this team identity and culture, and perpetuate all of the best practices that we've developed.
Thank you.
All right, one just like very quick answer that you should provide. So there's certainly people here from small companies. What is the one pitfall that someone should avoid as when their company will grow a million X?
I have a really quick answer for this, which is like logging schemas. One of the data scientists on my team recently, he's Israeli, and I'm going to misquote him, but he's like, there's this ancient saying that like it takes like 100 smart people to get a rock from a well that was thrown by one stupid person, and that's how it feels to like work with bad logging, because it's like you have to have this like giant team of data engineers to be like, what was happening in like 2012 with our data, because we need to have year-over-year numbers, but like the logging is like totally all over the place, completely unorganized. You don't even know what's there, and that is because at the time like the team was moving as fast as they could, and that was the best way for them to move quickly. They had some logging in place to get some answers about how the feature was being used, but they weren't necessarily thinking about like, hey, like 3 years from now, we really need someone to be able to read this logging and understand it, and then create data tables that will be really useful for other people than yourself. So I think that is my big takeaway, is like make sure that there is a lot of structure around the logging that you're putting in place, because that will save you so much time in the future.
Ditto.
Yeah. Ditto. Yeah. No, I thought it was really. You were saying like, what's the one thing to avoid? I feel like most of growth is just continuously screwing up in large and small ways, and like so narrowing it down to one would be hard. I would say one of the things that you should avoid doing is avoid kidding yourself about a lot of the decisions you will make early on. Like I remember there are, I would say probably 20% of the contributions I still have in the Uber code base, which are getting smaller by the day because I'm managing now, were things that I implemented at least 4 years ago that I was like, this is going to last like 2 weeks and I'll get around to like fixing it and like unscrewing this up, right? I'm talking about like, I think there's a lot of knowing laughs there. And like, first of all, like recognize, okay, that's clearly not ever going to be the case for anyone who's like working at a high growth company. But the other thing is like recognizing that that's totally okay. Like that's sort of the process working as intended sometimes.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
In the name of